All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ask a Catholic Therapist. My name is Dr. Matt Bruninger, and on today's episode, we're going to try to answer this question. This is a tough question, man. Okay, so it says, my question is, how are spiritual illnesses distinct from the mental? Is there a reputable list of them that I can share with my students? How can young people better figure out if they need a priest or spiritual director versus a therapist or a counselor? That's a great question. It's a great question. So let's try to pick that first one apart. That's really tough. How are the spiritual illnesses distinct from the mental? Look, I'll tell you how I think about it. I think fundamentally the difference between, say, spiritual illnesses and mental illnesses is that spiritual illnesses begin with sin. The cause of spiritual illness is the deliberate or willful turning of one's back on God. Now, certainly that can have psychological consequences when we're cut off from the life of grace, when we're not living a moral life, because we're an integrated being, body and soul. There can be, our thought process can become distorted, our loves and desires can become distorted. We can relate to people in unhealthy ways that might give rise to anxiety or depression, right? So certainly there can be a psychological effect of a spiritual illness, but I guess maybe the best way of beginning to think about it is a spiritual illness begins with a spiritual cause, that is a sin. A mental illness begins with a psychological cause. There's not a predominant spiritual or spiritual cause or sin at the root of it. It's something psychological. It's somebody who has sort of a maladaptive or unhealthy thought pattern. They're not thinking accurately about reality, or somebody who has low self-esteem, or somebody who has an interpersonal pattern that gives rise to maybe behaviors that are unhealthy or don't allow them to pursue what they desire, and so anxiety and depression arise. Or avoidance. Avoidance, oftentimes in my experience, can be a cause of a number of our psychological sufferings. We try to avoid uncomfortable thoughts, memories, experiences, bodily feelings, and we spend so much effort and energy trying to avoid them that we create a whole host of other problems. That's how I think about it. And I'm open to I think there's probably a lot of space for discussion here, but I'm open to being convinced otherwise and hearing other thoughts. So spiritual illnesses have spiritual causes, psychological illnesses have psychological causes. Now, certainly psychological illness, right? Mental health issues can have spiritual effects. It can be harder to relate to God. We can cut ourselves off from grace. We can be less disposed to grace because we're suffering psychologically. So just like spiritual illnesses can have psychological effects, psychological illnesses can have spiritual effects. And right, this makes sense, again, because we're a body-soul unity. And so the real question, though, is sort of maybe what should you treat first? And so the question is it always best to treat a spiritual illness with a spiritual remedy first? Or is it always best to treat a psychological illness with a psychological remedy first? And that's where I think it gets really tricky, and I think the answer is it depends. I think that really depends on prudential judgment, and you might say, I don't know, as a general rule of thumb, yeah, I guess, but I can imagine cases where somebody has started off with a sin, and over years, the effect of that sin has been sort of a profound. It has had a profound psychological effect, and so as a result of that, the person can't even see the sin any longer. They don't even recognize that it started with a sin, and so what you might do there is you might start a psychological remedy or treatment that opens one up to a spiritual treatment. Maybe their thoughts have become so distorted about God and faith and religion that they're not even open to a spiritual remedy anymore. So in my mind, it's going to depend. It's going to depend upon how far away we are from maybe the initial spiritual cause or sin. What was the severity of that? How long has the person been experiencing sort of psychological effects, and how intense have those psychological effects been? Same with the psychological causes. So I can imagine cases where I might begin with a sort of spiritual approach, because for some people, psychological approaches are scary and not to be trusted, or it feels like it's going to be like really overwhelming to look at certain thoughts, feelings, memories. And so starting with the spiritual feels more manageable, it feels more comfortable, it feels safer. And so again, in some ways, and you have to, I know this might sound like a cop-out, but you have to forgive me here. I think in some ways, for a talented therapist, they'll have the sort of prudence to know whether or not, right, the spiritual needs to be addressed and to what extent, but they'll also have the prudence to know whether to begin with recommending a spiritual remedy, something like confession or going to see a spiritual director, or whether to begin with a psychological remedy. And I think that will depend upon a number of factors, and they'll be able to, the goal here is always what will open up and dispose the individual to get the kind of help that they need ultimately. And so knowing that person really well, knowing their story, knowing where they're stuck and how they think, and what emotions they try to distance themselves from or avoid, and right, all of that will shape how you approach this. And so it might be that you go in one door to come out the other. A talented therapist will thoughtfully approach this. Okay, how do you know whether you need a spiritual director or a therapist? I generally think when it comes to spiritual direction versus therapy, most of us don't need spiritual directors until we are sort of, moving along the path of the spiritual life. Like if you're not praying regularly, if you don't have a consistent life of prayer, then I think a spiritual director might be overkill initially. Now, having a spiritual figure in your life who can give you some wisdom or advice, that's okay, and we need that. We all need somebody who's further along in the spiritual journey than us to speak into our lives. But when I'm talking about like really full-on deliberate spiritual direction, I'm pretty sure St. Teresa of Avila says that you really begin to need this when you're in the illuminative way. So, the threefold sort of spiritual path that is sometimes laid out in traditional Catholic spirituality. It's the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way. And these are the stages of the spiritual life. And the purgative ways in the beginning, when we're purifying ourselves of significant mortal sins, it tends to be characterized by like more activity on the part of the individual. But the illuminative way is when we start to really, the action of grace really begins to take over and our prayer life changes. And St. Teresa of Avila says that, I believe it's her, don't quote me, I believe it's her, but she says that it's like the sine qua non, like you have to have a spiritual director here, because this is where the spiritual life starts to get tricky. So I would generally say, look, for young high school kids, having a spiritual guide who they trust, someone who can encourage them in prayer, somebody who can introduce them to different types of prayer, this is important. But in terms of do they need a full-on spiritual director, like probably not, unless they're already sort of moving along that spiritual path. What most of them probably need is friendships with older adults who are further along the way. So I hope that helps. Let me see, is there anything else to the question? Look, this is what I would say, if somebody's experiencing problems that are causing significant impairment or distress in their life, then a therapist or a counselor is always a good call. And oftentimes I think a spiritual guide, spiritual mentor, or a spiritual director can be like a really beautiful adjunct to that, especially if the person is open to it, interested in it, and want to blend the two. So hope that helps. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out, askacatholictherapist@gmail.com. And thanks for listening, y'all. If you like what we're doing at Ask a Catholic Therapist, follow us on Facebook. If you want to ask a question, email us at askacatholictherapist@gmail.com. Don't forget to like this video and to subscribe to the channel in order to get more great content. Peace.